Hello there, and welcome to this special episode of A Language I Love Is. While I continue to work on new episodes about great new languages with great new guests, this episode takes a break from the usual format since it's a conversation between me and Dr. Jackson Crawford. Jackson may well be known to many of you already as YouTube's resident Old Norse expert, who blesses the internet with regular content on linguistics, archaeology, and history, all presented in front of stunning scenery. I was over the moon to be invited back onto his channel to discuss my recently submitted PhD work on word order and really old Indo-European languages, and also this very podcast. The full conversation will be available on YouTube in due course, but for the moment, here are some audio excerpts.
So, what would you rather talk about first? You want to talk about your podcast first? You want to talk about your dissertation work first?
I think, seeing as it leads nicely on, I'd love to talk about the dissertation. I haven't actually spoken about it to anyone, so it's still pretty fresh in my head. For context, I submitted about a month ago now, and yeah, it's still weighing on my mind. So I'm more than happy to talk about that.
That sounds great. Well, would you give us a précis of it? And again, if you want to share anything, you are a co-host, so you are welcome to share anything that you would like.
Gladly, yeah. I can try and share the thing itself, which it's a mighty document. There are many reasons, not just quality for its length. It was also the quantity of stuff that I had to get through. Yes, so here's the document. Here's the beginning of it. So the title is Reconstructing the Left Peripheries of Proto-Indo-European. So I kept it, short and snappy for the title. Submitted to the University of Edinburgh, which is my university, has been for 3 years now. And for context as well, for comparison with you, Jackson, British PhDs tend to be a lot shorter than American PhDs. So 3 years, 3.5 years is actually quite normal. If people were wondering, that's not enough time. But yeah, you dive into it. But a really nice thing, I mentioned Edinburgh, a really nice thing is that because Edinburgh is extremely passionate about public outreach, so sharing the knowledge that the university generates with a wider non-specialist audience, it's actually included in the rules of submission that you have to include a summary for non-specialists, which I really like. So you have the abstract, which is very typical, the abstract, which is written in fairly, standard academese. But whereas the lay summary was then my chance to take a step back and say, how would I explain it to somebody, like the rest of my family, for example? I come from a long line of non-linguists. So it's very good for me to write this piece. So yeah, I mean, I won't read it, the whole thing, because that would take too long. But essentially, this is a PhD in historical syntax. So historical syntax, deconstructing that two-word term, it's word order through time, essentially. Languages have word order in general. We have these kind of abstract rules that govern in some languages more strictly than others, but that they kind of determine in what order our bits of vocabulary go. So obviously that's we say words. That's a very weird term. Linguists aren't entirely sure what a word is, but words, affixes as well can be they come within the remit of syntax, and more specifically, the whole PhD was to explore the question of what can we say about the word order of a prehistoric language, a language for which we do not have written evidence. It predates the written record. It's too old to have been written down. More specifically still, a particular prehistoric language, arguably the most famous prehistoric language out there, which is Proto-Indo-European. So that's the ancestor language of this huge spread of languages across Eurasia originally, and then in the modern era, across the Americas as well. It includes languages like English, like Persian, like French, like Old Norse, like Old Irish, which quickly became my favorite over the course of researching this. So what can we say about the word order of this prehistoric language? More specifically still, and then I'll shut up, it's too much to study the whole word order of a language. I think that's enough for one career, let alone one PhD, one 3-year PhD. So it's specifically the left peripheries, which is a metaphor. This is a term that we use in syntax. It's taken from, well, it's really taken from European writing systems where you read from left to right. The left periphery essentially means the beginning. It means the beginning of a clause. So a clause is something like the cat sat on the mat, and the noun phrase. The noun phrase built around nouns, so something like the big blue cat. Cats don't tend to be blue, but anyway, you get the point. So what tends to come at the beginning of those two syntactic units, the clause and the noun phrase, in Proto-Indo-European? So that, in a nutshell, is what I think you need to know to start this conversation off. Did that all make sense?
Yeah, hopefully.
Yep.
And anyone who wants further clarification, of course, go into the chat. So
Please do.
How did you go about this study?
Yes. So this is very much a research-based PhD, a research in the sense of using secondary sources. There are many ways in which we can go about researching languages. Obviously, you can use statistics to talk about what is normal in word order, what is a kind of a basic word order, what is an unusual word order. That's not me, I have to say. While I've done my best to get up to speed with the statistical studies, this really, this whole thesis stands on the shoulders of giants, of other scholars who are themselves standing on the shoulders of other linguists who are themselves standing on the shoulders of, well, I guess, archivists and archaeologists all the way down. So really it was a case of working through the previous literature concerning a set of Indo-European languages. There's this discrete set that my supervisors and I agreed on at the very beginning. It was very specific kind of criteria for the languages that I was going to study in order to talk about Proto-Indo-European. The reason, or the criteria, was that they had to be old. So that's the kind of principle: is the older the language is, the closer it is to its prehistoric ancestor. So French, fine; Latin, better; or modern Greek, fine; ancient Greek, much better. And they had to be a wide distribution, so that they are spread across the kind of traditional sub-branches of Indo-European. For that reason, I chose languages like Latin, ancient Greek, Vedic Sanskrit, Old Norse, Old English, Old Irish, and I've forgotten one, Old Church Slavonic. These are, I should stress, not contemporary languages. They are, they differ wildly, but for the distribution, I had to go with a kind of a, there's like 5,000 years difference, I think, or something between the oldest and the youngest. But still, for the good distribution, I had to, go with that group. And the reason why you need this set is because getting back to prehistoric languages for which we have no evidence, is traditionally done through something called the comparative method. So that's, as the name suggests, taking a group of languages, looking at the ways in which they are alike, we're looking at the ways, crucially, in which they correspond to one another, and saying off the basis of these correspondences, well, they're appearing so strongly, these aren't loan words, this isn't contact influence, this isn't coincidence, these are legacies of the prehistoric language for which we have no evidence. So it's using the historical to get back to the prehistorical. This is not a new idea. I cannot claim responsibility for any of these ideas, the methodology. This is really old. This goes back to sort of the end of the 18th century, kind of has a big heyday in the 19th century. But crucially, through all of those kind of 200 years of which, when people are using the comparative method to get back to prehistoric languages, they're doing it with sounds and vocabulary. So you might know a famous thing like Grimm's Law, for example. Grimm's Law concerns Germanic languages. You've got things like a p becoming a f in Germanic, so English father, Latin pater, ancient Greek pater, Sanskrit pitar. And really, it's good. Like, it works. It's basically uncontroversial now, and it's upon this pretty sturdy rock that the whole idea of Indo-European has been, proposed. And I think, with the exception of people who tend to have a kind of political axe to grind, Proto-Indo-European as a thing is pretty well accepted today. But what about word order? Like, we've got some sounds, and we've arranged those sounds into strings of sounds, i.e., words, and paired them with a meaning. How then did speakers of Proto-Indo-European, I use that term loosely, but in whatever state this ancient language actually existed, how did they string those words into sentences? What was their word order, essentially? And this, I will say, is very much an ongoing project. This is controversial because some people have said we can't know, just not possible. And my future Viva examiner, and a couple of our friends, like I said, it's a close-knit group. There's dozens of us, dozens. We think it is actually possible that you can make claims about prehistoric word order that are as not correct or true, but as cogent, as convincing as the claims that we make about the sounds and the vocabulary of Proto-Indo-European. So that's it. That's the elevator pitch. Sorry, I'm British. Lift pitch. Yeah.
All right. And so what kind of conclusions were you able to draw?
Yeah. So I suppose the very general, the biggest conclusion, the macro conclusion that I would want to emphasize is that we should think of Proto-Indo-European as a language with syntax, as in it had abstract rules that the speakers were acquiring as children, and were applying, and they were slotting their bits of vocabulary into abstract patterns, i.e. syntax, what we call syntax. That might sound quite dry, but that kind of big conclusion is very much in response to the idea that the reasonable conclusion, if you look at, say, Latin, ancient Greek, especially Sanskrit, it looks like word order anarchy. So you could possibly draw the conclusion based on that Proto-Indo-European had no word order. There was no syntax. You could put any word in any order, so long as it was a properly formed word, so long as you had the affixes at the end. If it was a verb, it had inflection. If it was a noun, it had declension. But otherwise, you could just put anything in any particular order. And I would very much like to push back on that. I think we can explain so much of what we find across in ancient Indo-European, historical Indo-European languages, if we presume that they come from an ancestor that had syntax. But otherwise, so many little features, smaller details that I've concluded become harder to explain. Like it becomes like, okay, fine, the ancestor didn't have syntactic constraints, syntactic laws, rules. Well, Latin clearly has them. They're not as strong as perhaps, say, French, but they're there in Latin. So I think that would be the takeaway point, that the noun phrase and the clause had syntax. And I'm very happy to elaborate on what that syntax looked like, but that's the takeaway point.
And I think you're right about that. I mean, if you find yourself in a position to teach one of these old Indo-European languages, as I have with this Old Norse class, for example, the two things that I think most rattle the nerves of people who don't have previous experience with such language is A, all of the different endings, and then B, as you said, the apparent anarchy of word order. And certainly from a modern English perspective, something like Old Norse, something like Latin, does have kind of anarchic word order. But if you spend some time inhabiting these languages, reading them frequently, maybe even notating, as you do, some particular aspects of what comes before and after what, you find that there is some order behind the apparent chaos. that there is a net, as it were. The net isn't as tight, but
Mm.
there is a net. And of course, whatever the exact shape of that net is, as you pointed out, also, the earlier the language, the more likely that you're looking at some inherited features of that net.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I really like that metaphor. I really like that. I wish I'd written that. The net is perfect. Yeah, it's loose, but it's there, and you can't do the kind of syntactic research that we can do today with speakers who are still alive, but you do over time pick up a sense of grammaticality, of like
Mhm.
boundaries in which the speakers would just not cross. And I think in some cases there are many reasons for why that may have been, but I think in some cases these are, I can think of no better word than syntactic. So for example, if I can be a bit more specific, one of the kind of conclusions is that I think that one of the pretty safe bits of syntax that we can reconstruct is WH movement. So WH movement is essentially forming questions. So in English, for example, you could form a good question with the WH word. So that's, what, why, who, when. We tend to put it at the beginning. We call it movement because it kind of looks like it's moved, right? Normally in English, the object of the verb comes after the verb. So, you see the woman. But in a question, you put the object at the beginning. Who did you see? Or whom, if if you're that way inclined. Whom did you see? Um, and this is, I mean, so consistent, not universal, but so consistent across the Indo-European languages. I mean, this is not something, even in Sanskrit, which looks like, it can look like word soup sometimes. Dealing with the Vedas, these extremely old texts, among our oldest sources for Indo-European, even they show WH movement where they're putting the question words at the beginning, they're putting relative words at the beginning. So, the man who I see, the who is relative, it goes at the beginning of the relative clause. Sanskrit's doing that too. Like I said, not universal. I think this is something that emerges at a later point in the history of Proto-Indo-European than the earliest one that we can get back to, because there's the problem of Hittite. Hittite is, as people may know, is a fascinating Indo-European language, which I didn't work on. Done my best to familiarize myself, but Hittite doesn't seem to show WH movement, which is, did they never have it? Did they lose it? It's fascinating, but I just simply said for a later stage of the ancestor language, I think, all the kind of the principles that guide the reconstruction of sounds and of vocabulary. So these really well-established principles. Is it old? Is it the most frequent? Things like that. I think a kind of syntactic constraint like WH movement, like forming questions, it can be easily reconstructed, securely reconstructed back to some stage of Proto-Indo-European. So that would be one example of a bit of syntax that I think is really, really old.
Mhm. And of course, it's not a universal, as intuitive as it seems to speakers of Indo-European languages.
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean, arguably Chinese doesn't have it. Arguably, kind of modern day colloquial French doesn't have it. Obviously you can say something like qu'est-ce que tu sais? What do you know? But you can also say tu sais quoi?
Mhm.
It's it's which is kind of fine in English as well, but quite common in French these days. So yeah, it's not universal.
Yeah, and I feel like it is related in a way to the the classic topic comment structure that you're signaling right away. Here comes a question,
Yeah.
right? So topic information seeking
Yes.
is kind of what you're flagging at the very front there. And one thing that I was thinking about as you mentioned this, that the net is looser than in English, but still there, is that all languages have some kind of net this way, right? That you cannot have completely anarchic word order because
Yeah.
otherwise no one knows what you're talking about. Right? I mean, like it's a semi-obvious thing to say, but it's not a perfectly obvious thing to say that with there are bounds on this that are just the limitations of the human brain. If you can't have an adjective modifying a noun be,
Mm.
15 utterances later. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But people will exaggerate these early Indo-European languages and make it sound like it's that way. Like everyone's just going around talking like they're, I don't know, Virgil.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that doesn't help that so many of our sources for these languages are poetry or they are metrical, so they are kind of working to set templates. But even still, I mean, that's where you really strike gold as a syntactician. That might sound, a bit counterintuitive that, you want to find the syntax of ancient Greek. How can you do that when you're studying something like Homer, where it's very much set according to these metrical templates, set according to, a syllable weight? Um, isn't that useless? Well, no, actually, it was a friend of mine who really hammered this point home to me. It's in those contexts, and when you still find syntactic constraints that you know that you're getting back to, you've reached the borders of grammaticality for Homer, whoever he or she or they was. You've actually struck kind of syntactic bedrock, and it is absolutely there in the Iliad and the Odyssey. For example, one of the things I absolutely concentrated on was subordinated. So words like because, while, since, as, that in English. These have been absolutely pivotal to my first chapter, which has the kind of catchy title of C in Proto-Indo-European. But that is like Homer really consistently puts subordinators first in their clause, occasionally second, occasionally followed by things that look kind of, they may be emphatic. I think they're probably topical, but really, I think Homer's putting, they're in first or second position. That's syntax.
Mhm.
Likewise in the Rig Veda, things, it's again annoying because subordinating conjunctions, these are European terms, Eurocentric terms, but they can't be applied easily to the Rig Vedas. But there are things that tell you the type of the clause, they're first or they're second. Like it's extremely consistent. That's syntax.
Mhm.
So I love those moments when you can actually kind of do great work with this. Sorry, I'm just
Well,
trying to
and
find. Yeah, there we are.
and I mean, further to your point about poetry, poetry still has to be intelligible to some member of the native speaking audience. It
Yeah,
cannot, it can play with norms, but it can't just utterly violate all the norms. So,
exactly. Yeah, and that is something I that was a kind of safety net of my safety, an intellectual safety net that I could say, you could spiral while researching the syntax of dead languages. You could kind of fall into philological pessimism and just say it's all useless. We can't use these sources. That's not true. Situate these sources in the context in which they were written. And you can reassure yourself that actually, yes, some of this is syntax that we are getting back to. That was, if I may, that safety net saved one language of the set that I studied, which was Old Church Slavonic.
hmm.
Old Church Slavonic for context. Old Church Slavonic is a Slavic language. It's the oldest Slavic language that we have evidence for. So it's dating from sort of like the 9th century onwards. And we have some texts, and they're good long texts, for getting stuck into, but they are clearly so heavily influenced by Greek
Hmm.
because they're all part of a particular point in time. You've got these two saints called Cyril or Constantine and Methodius. They're kind of preaching to the Slavs, trying to convert them to Christianity, and they're translating Greek texts to help them in their mission. And you could just dismiss Old Church Slavonic outright. You could just say, come on, this is not native Slavic word order. But still, like there are kind of two ways in which you can make headway with World Old Church Slavonic. One is that words that are enclitic, they are quite kind of particular in their position. So that's definitely not a Greek influence. But more importantly, and more relevant to my point, Old Church Slavonic it had to be understandable to the
Hmm.
Slavs they were trying to convert to Christianity. If you had these people come along, I mean, I think they would have been native Greek speakers, but they spoke Slavic extremely well. These two saints and their acolytes arriving in Greater Moravia, what's now Slovakia and the Czech Republic, and if they are just saying, "Yeah, we know your language, but the word order is just gibberish," they're not going to convert anybody.
Right.
So there's a safety net to doing research with that language, and that safety net is intelligibility. So, yeah, that's how I managed to say anything at all about Old Church Slavonic.
Would you take a couple questions from the chat at this juncture?
Absolutely. Let me stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody.
Jay says, do vocabulary, sounds, and grammar and word order all change in concert among related languages, Germanic, Romance, etc., with the same readiness? If not, can you tell things about linguistic groups by the difference between their shared vocabulary versus syntax?
I forgot the high caliber of questions that you get in this. This is fantastic. Do vocabulary sounds in concert? I like that. That's a good question. I would say that the general consensus is that syntax is quite slow to change. If I understand your question correctly, Jay, it's like we imagine a kind of different components of a language, very crudely put, sounds, the phonology bit, the lexical bit, the grammar bit. I think there's a kind of idea that syntax is quite reluctant to change, but it does change. It definitely does over time. I would say that it's really hard to speak accurately about this because I want to be cautious, and I can't put like one syntactic constraint per generation. I can't put a speed on it, but I would say that the lexical, the lexical is definitely more open to change. So we can think of in our own lifetimes, new bits of vocabulary coming in. And if you take a step back as a historical linguist, you can say, well, that's change. That's change over time. They're taking these words in. The kind of sociological conditions are right for that to happen. But syntax it seems to be a bit slower. Some linguists even say that syntax is inert. It never changes, which I don't agree with, but I think it's a fascinating idea that the syntax changes really reluctantly, the rules of the language. It's only when, like, say, take the case of English. English over time goes from being fairly flexible in its word order to being a lot less flexible, modern English. And in the kind of transition from Old to Middle English, you do see there are other things going on, such as the endings. We're losing a lot of endings. We're losing, kind of that lack of grammatical information, things like case and lots of kind of verbal information. And the idea of syntactic inertia is that it's only because the phonology and morphology is just decaying that the syntax has to catch up. I think it's a really interesting idea, but I'm not sure. I think syntactic change does happen because of, yeah. What do you think, Jackson?
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly counterindicated by something that's happening in English syntax right now.
Yeah.
Right, which is subject dropping in questions.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, I think most of us it may actually be different in the UK versus in the US, but I think at least in the US, your basic colloquial question is starting to not have a subject anymore.
Yeah.
Heading up the canyon, like that coffee,
Yeah.
driving this way. Right, like that this is a fairly recent phenomenon, but I feel like it's on the march, and I don't feel like that's triggered by any kind of morphological or phonological change. It's just it's a purely syntactic change. And you can't do it with statements. It's associated with the question domain. Because if you say the equivalent thing as a statement, it sounds quote unquote stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Have a phone, talking to Danny, right? But like that sounds dumb. But phrase it as a question. Have a phone, talking to Danny. There you go. Right. So subject dropping in questions is happening right now. I could see it becoming standard. It's already something that no one really blinks an eye at. But I don't think that 100 years ago it was normal at all. except in maybe very, very colloquial contexts. And what's the phonological or morphological conditioner for that? Nothing has changed that I
I
can
wouldn't
think
say
of.
there is one. I could talk about kind of external things. I could talk about hazard a guess on something like typing, and so usage, language usage, but that would be going beyond of syntax. But I completely agree. And crucially, American children are hearing this.
Yeah.
This is their input, and they're learning this. They are, and so I think. I mean, syntax is really hard to predict. I do historical syntax, not futuristic syntax, but I'd guess this is going to become, with each generation, less and less unusual, less and less kind of marked. When I say marked, that's a kind of very useful but strange linguistic term, meaning essentially it's a special word. It's going to become less special, and it's going to become normal, at a guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I think it already is. I think it's just no one has acknowledged it yet because no one writes that way formally. But
No.
it's already at the point where if you do have your subject in the question, it sounds formal.
Mm.
Do you have any, like it sounds
Yes.
already stuffy.
Do you have a phone? It just
Right.
sounds
Right.
needlessly excessive. Yeah, exactly. I couldn't agree more. It's a really, really nice example. I will remember that one. And yeah, that's syntax in action. It just all it needs to be, it needs to be passed on to the next generation. And that was something, if I may, that was something that I'm so happy to get stuck into. I do feel that historical syntax specifically is in a really good place right now. Like I went to a conference last year. It's called DIGS, Diachronic Generative Syntax. It was in Paris. It was wonderful. And I just sat there pretty clueless because everybody was a lot more senior and more intelligent than me. But I just felt that people were going beyond the bounds of what syntax was a few years ago and really getting stuck into other factors that may influence this. And I mention this because I mention this because so that is kind of suffused through a lot of the work, and I dare to think my own work is really getting into acquisition. So language acquisition, what is actually going on? I'm not saying we're right,
Right.
we syntacticians, because there are people who actually specialize in this, but it's in a healthy place, I think. And that I really, at least in the introduction to my thesis, tried to stress that, well, how does it change? And really the kind of phrasing that I came up with to explain it to myself and to the reader was that it flourishes at the micro level. So tiny differences between your parents' syntax in their heads and yours, assuming that, of course, that you received, your language from your parents. We, talk about your primary linguistic input, whoever that was.
Right.
And I think that that's just so key because like syntactic change stops being so abstract. It stops being this thing that we observe in historical texts, and we bring it right down to how is this actually happening? It has to be micro. Macro changes, well, crucially, especially at a young age, they will produce word orders that are noticeably different. They are divergent from your parents, what your parents are saying, and therefore you'll be corrected. That's the
Right.
crucial thing. We do this with our children. We correct our children. In doing so, it's almost like a large garden. You've got the kind of the smaller weeds growing and the big trees growing. It's the big trees that get cut down
Right.
by your
Right.
parents.
Right.
Yeah. And it's the little grass that is able to flourish and to be ignored by the people. And that's crucially, I think for me, that's where the divergences across time come from. The to put it in jargon, but in I think to put it succinctly, the diachronic, so through time, is really synchronic in time. Like it's yeah, there's no passage through time without snapshots of time.
Right.
So yeah, that's the way I think about these things. It's just I'm just so happy because I love my field, and it's just so nice that people are talking about this stuff these days.
Well, and I think too, it seems like, and you probably are and will continue to be part of this. Syntax is being presented as this is a micro change itself, but it makes a difference. Is being presented as something more interesting than it was even 15 years ago. Because
Mm.
I feel like 15 years ago in grad school, the syntax classes we had to do, um, were just like, all right, you're going to sit down, you're going to read a bunch of Chomsky, and you're going to make some diagrams,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, Like you get some good fundamentals that way, but it's not
Yeah.
ripping. Um, and actually relating it to questions like acquisition or historical linguistics, I think that you get something much more dynamic and interesting. And also people need to know, and this is something that's not always presented well, that what is meant by generative syntax is not a single frozen thing that
Mm.
emerged perfectly conceived from the mind of Chomsky or something like that, right?
No.
It's a large conceptual framework that tolerates many different variants and different ideas and changes all the time.
Yeah.
Um, and has inspired and interacts with some other subfields in generative semantics, right?
Yeah.
Which is so tied up with syntax too in ways that I think are often underappreciated.
Yeah. And if and neurolinguistics as well. There's
Mhm.
people working with neurologists to basically, I think it's kind of it's not everything, but it is in the DNA that generative syntax, which emerges as a school of thought with Chomsky, end of the 1950s, so many of the stereotypes are kind of true but outdated. One of the stereotypes, I say stereotypes, not the right word, the impressions of the field. I have a lot of time for people who are not convinced by it. I'm describe myself as something of a reluctant generativist because I think it works, but it needs to be made to work properly. I think, anyway, I won't get into that. We're not talking about generative syntax, but I mention this because it's one of the ideas is that it does make certain claims about the brain, very abstract claims, but it does make certain claims as to, even if you don't believe in universal grammar, which is fine, I don't personally, even if you don't go for a lot of the headline ideas of generative syntax, it does still basically boil down to this external thing we do comes from in the inside, internally, right? I think that there's processing going on. That's kind
Yeah.
of the distilled essence of generative syntax. And I think it's so great that now people are having the kind of academic eagerness, academic humility, even to then go to neurologists and say, well, are we right?
Yeah.
We're making claims about the brain. Are we right? And sometimes yes, and sometimes no, which is, I think that's great. Like it's like a big jungle generative syntax, like it's or a forest. It's grown. It's really grown, and it's perhaps outgrown certain ways of thinking, which I'm very happy about.
Mhm. I appreciate everything you said just there too. And for decades and centuries, people will continue to disagree about all these questions. Is there a
Mhm.
universal grammar? Isn't there? How big is it in a sense? What does it look like? But we
Mm.
can all still uh, study these questions using much the same terminology. Cameron asked, did you find any detectable relationship between syntax and the amount of inflection in a particular language? E.g., do more inflected languages have looser syntax?
Oh, Cameron, what a question. Uh, yes. Did I find it? That's a tricky one. I'm reluctant to give a kind of clear and definitive answer to that because so much of historical linguistics is we tie ourselves up in knots thinking is there a causal relationship here or is this just coincidence? It's possible that two aspects of a language, say as I mentioned earlier, kind of dividing a language up, it's possible that they could be just changing independently of one another. It's more than enough work to say what is happening and it's even more work to say why it is happening. um, I would say, on the whole, that the association does hold. I'll put money on that. I'll stick my neck out. I think the association between less morphology and less kind of specifically grammatical morphology that's giving you grammatical information, yes, it does correlate to a more inflexible word order. I think that's a pretty it's pretty hard to argue against as a point. Like we see this over and over again. I'll say correlation at least. They are going together. I will only add the, excuse me, I will only add the caveat from my perspective is that there's definitely sophisticated, complex syntactic constraints already before languages start to lose this morphology as well. And I certainly don't want to claim that this was bound to happen. I think, even though we see similar things happening across the different subfamilies, we see this, similar things happening in Germanic that also happen in Romance. I think it's, I think it's easy to say and safe to say that these changes are correlated. I'm much warier about saying that this was always going to happen across Indo-European, because in some branches of the family it hasn't, but even still, I mean, it's as a pattern, it does keep repeating itself over and over again. That these languages do lose their morphology. I'm trying to think of exceptions, but there really aren't many. It's a really big question. I think I'm going to say yes, they correlate, and I'm not going to claim anything bigger than that because it gets really interesting and really complicated.
Yeah, I think my impression too is that syntax can become a tighter net without morphology
Mm,
becoming more reduced.
yeah.
I think that one of the things that distinguishes modern Icelandic from Old Norse is not a whole lot of morphological simplification, but a somewhat tighter syntactic net.
Mm.
So I think they can happen independently of one another, but maybe that there's sort of a clock that's running on both of them that tends to run at a similar pace.
Yeah, exactly. A question about, if I may, Icelandic, to add to your point, does Icelandic have verb first clauses? Not questions, but like declarative clauses.
Not normally, uh, but Old Norse does.
Does. There you
Yeah,
go. It does.
yeah.
So
I
that's
mean,
a syntactic change with no change in, barely any change in morphology.
yeah, very little. I mean, there's some like yeah. It depends on how uh, nitpicky you want to get. I can get nitpicky and say no, there's a fair amount, but on
Mm.
the surface, no, there's not that much morphological change.
Mhm.
So I think that's interesting, right? And
Extremely. I would love to continue working on Old Norse because I think there's more. Old Norse and English and give really good kind of ground for this exact thing of syntax changing on its own terms. Because, we have, for context, so you mentioned earlier, to expand on that, you mentioned that we have across a lot of languages, especially early Indo-European languages, we have a general sense of you put the topic first. So whatever's topical, whatever's known, whatever is known to the audience, known to you, whatever is background information, you put that first. So I just did it in that sentence. I started with I started with a very, very long kind of shifted object, and then I got onto the real point of the sentence, which is that you put it first. Um, and this is Latin is pretty securely topic and then comment, and like what you know and what's new, what's old, what's new. That's it. This is the idea. It's a very old idea from the kind of Prague school of linguistics. And in Germanic, excluding Gothic, but in Germanic, so like Old Norse, Old English, you see a kind of syntactica. It's hard to say what's really going on, but it kind of that never goes away, but it kind of morphs
mm,
into what we think of as verb second. I think the verb second, this famous Germanic phenomenon, to explain the idea that you put the verb is second, it's the second thing in the clause. So something like in German, ich lese das Buch, so I read the book. Das Buch lese ich, or something like heute lese ich das Buch. In all those cases, lese, the verb to read, I read, is second. Very famous kind of Germanic phenomenon, which English has almost lost. And I think you can really situate that within the context of Latin, ancient Greek, Sanskrit, and really say this is the much older topic then comment structure. But why it happens, why Germanic speakers consistently thought, hey, it's a pretty good idea to start the comment with the verb, as a kind of bookmark, right? Topic first, then the verb, basically telling the audience, here's the new information. And that over time, I don't want to speak for Icelandic, but I think essentially in German, the thing preceding the verb is not necessarily topical. So it's morphing for some reason. It's really interesting how what we have in Latin becomes what we have in Norse, recognizably, but not what, like, Icelandic has gone another step further, from what I know.
Mhm. Well, and Old Norse and Modern Icelandic are not consistently V2, but
Right.
the continental Scandinavian languages are, right? Norwegian, Swedish, Danish do this. Could be German influence, but I mean, you already see a tendency toward it, right? I mean, in
Mm.
prose and Old English and Old High German, and I would even say Old Norse often tends toward it without getting there consistently. But yeah, there's something, some space that that verb occupies in the speaker's mind,
Yeah.
that I think you're right. It's like thinking of it as the beginning of the comment phase is interesting. But obviously it morphs after that into just being like, no, this is where verbs are, because soon you have adverbs or whatever preceding that.
Yeah.
Um,
If I may, I'm very much paraphrasing George Wogden here. His amazing book, which was originally his PhD thesis, which is kind of the inspiration for my whole work. He has some very interesting ideas. I don't know if they're original to him, but that essentially adverbs might be the key to this, the kind of breakdown, because it's so interesting. And this, again, this is really another great place where syntax is reaching out to other fields. In Old English, you have this fantastic narrative structure. So essentially, as I've hopefully I've tried to outline, in the older languages, you get verb second when you have a topic. So it goes topic verb. That's what verb second is in Old English, Old Norse, Old High German as well, not in the later languages, not least. And what that means is when you don't have a topic, you have verb first. The verb's still there, still occupying whatever that slot is, but you don't get a topic. And
mhm.
what that means is if you read something like a narrative text in Old English, something like the Old English translation of the Venerable Bede, of his history of the English-speaking peoples, what you get is this fascinating kind of narrative structure, which is an idea that syntax has taken from elsewhere, of the flow of the narrative. So it goes, I'm going to talk about a new thing, no topic. Therefore, verb first.
Mhm.
The following sentences, well, we have a topic. We know what we're talking about now. They're verb second. So you go verb first, verb second, verb second, verb second. New thing, verb first, verb second, verb second, verb second. You get this incredible kind of using word order to show the narrative flow of new thing, what I'm going to say about it. New thing, what I'm going to say about it. So, was there once a king whose name was Alfred? Alfred, the Alfred king went to fight the Vikings. Suddenly we have a verb second because we know we're talking about Alfred by this point. He's kind of the established topic.
Mhm.
And this is not what you see in the modern Germanic languages. This system seems to break down. And as far as I know, the blame is pointed on putting adverbs in that first position. So something like tha, then. So then the king, a king called Alfred came, something like that. For whatever reason, I don't want to bore you all. As you can tell, I'm very passionate about this, but
I don't think
yeah,
you're
like,
boring anyone.
okay,
I mean, this
it's
is
the usual
this is
reaction.
this is what my people come for.
Okay, so I'm amongst friends. That's nice.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. But yeah, no, it's fascinating and it seems to break down. And I'd love to keep going on this. So, that's everything for this special episode of A Language I Love Is. I hope you found the discussion with Jackson interesting and that I managed to make my answers comprehensible. If I didn't, I hope at least my enthusiasm for this subject was at least clear. Watch this space, or rather listen out, for new episodes of A Language I Love Is coming very soon about great languages, both modern and historical. Till the next time, keep well and keep loving language.